Hello and welcome to the course series Basic Cognitive Processes. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur. The topic of today's lecture is Basic Concepts in Cognitive Neuroscience. Today I will talk to you about the relationship between brain and behavior. We will talk about how the various structures in the brain and the various processes inside the brain contribute to the happening of mental states and mental functions. To begin with, let us ask what cognitive neuroscience actually is. Cognitive neuroscience may be defined as the study of physiological basis of cognition. You might remember in the earlier classes we have been talking constantly about cognitive psychology being an abstract science, and the entire framework of cognitive psychology resting on the fact that we do not really need physical substrates to rely upon while we are theorizing about how mental functions exist and what is basically the architecture of the mind. In today's lecture, we will try to actually connect that abstract architecture to a physical architecture, that is your brain. Just to give you an example about how your brain is involved in each and every activity you do, let us take the case of this boy John, who's actually who's sleeping, and every day every morning one of the first things that he does is he switches off the alarm clock that goes on right next to his head. Now, what must be happening in the brain when the alarm goes off? The first step that happens when the alarm goes off is that the sound reaches the ears of Juan, and these sound waves are then converted into a kind of an electrical signal from the ear, which is then communicated to the brain. The auditory areas in the brain actually help Jian really hear this sound, and then these signals, then a decision is taken whether to stop the alarm clock or to rise up because it's already morning time. That signal or that decision has to be communicated through the towards the motor areas of the brain, which actually which instruct Joan's hand to actually go out there and stop the alarm clock from ringing. Now, this is a very simple and probably one of the most simplest examples of a particular behavior that you might engage in, but this should give you an idea about that in the simplest and the most complex of the tasks that we do, or in the simplest or the most complex of mental functions that we can think about, our brain is constantly working. There is an entire system of communication and structures in the brain that actually collaborate together to bring about any kind of behavior that the human being involves in. So, let us talk about what do we do in cognitive neuroscience, or in today's lecture, so to be precise. In today's lecture, we will talk about the various structures of the brain and their relationship with the human cognitive processes. We will also look at a variety of methods to investigate the relationship between brain and behavior. Now, we will try to figure out also how these above two can actually contribute towards developing a theory of human cognition. Let us begin with the organization of the nervous system. The nervous system basically is a collection of hundreds of billions of specialized and interconnected cells through which the messages are sent from the brain to the rest of the body and vice versa. The most basic or the most primary parts of this nervous system are the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which links the central nervous system to our skin, our muscles and other glands in the body. A large part of our behavior is also controlled by the endocrine system, which is basically the chemical regulator of the body, which consists of glands that secretes a variety of hormones and other neurotransmitters that influence our behavior. So, here is a figure, you can actually have a look at it. So, here you will see the central nervous system, which is consisting of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which consists mainly of these peripheral nerves. Now, coming to neurons, the neurons basically are considered to be the basic building blocks of the brain. This theory was basically first proposed by Raymond Cajal, who discovered that the individual units called neurons were the basic building blocks of the brain, and that basically formed the centerpiece of a doctrine called the neuron doctrine. The neuron doctrine actually said that these individual cells transmit the signals in the nervous system, and that these cells are not continuous with other cells as was earlier proposed by the nerve net theory. So, we are talking about these neurons as single and independent units which connect to each other to relay particular kinds of signals which actually happen while the body is while the brain is processing a variety of stimuli, a variety of information that is incoming from the environment. Here you can see the figure of a neuron. You will see that at the leftmost there is this cell body which is basically where the nucleus of the neuron or the cell lies. Then you will see there are these projections from this cell body which are called dendrites. The job of them is basically to receive messages from other neurons or other cells. Then you will see this long fiber emanating from the cell body which is basically the axon. The axon basically does the task of transmitting signals from the cell body towards other cells. You will see at the end of this axon there are these structures called the terminal buttons, which actually form the connections between a particular neuron and the dendrites of another neuron to which this has to be connected. We will talk about this in more detail as we go ahead. Just to briefly remind you, so the cell body basically has the mechanisms to keep the cell alive. The dendrites are the branches which emerge out of the cell body. Axons transmit signals to other neurons, and a very important part of how the neurons communicate is the fact that for all neurons there is a gap between the end of a particular neuron's axon and the dendrites or the cell body of another neuron. This gap is called synapse. This is a very significant part of how the neurons communicate between each other. We will elaborate on how this communication happens as we go ahead. Now, these neurons also are not connected indiscriminately to one another. It is not like every neuron is connected to every other neuron. It is basically that these neurons are connected in form of special networks called neural circuits or neural networks, which are generally allocated towards a particular kinds of specific functions. Now, let us talk a bit about how the communication happens between these neurons. The nervous system generally operates using a electrochemical process. These neurons exist in an electrically charged environment, and both inside and outside of the neurons exist these charged particles called ions. Now, some of these particles could be positively charged while others could be negatively charged. When a neuron is inactive or resting, more of the plus charges, more of these positively charged ions are outside of the neuron, while a lot of these negative charged particles are existing inside of the neuron. As a result of this difference of charge, the resting potential or the basic charge of a neuron in a resting state is generally around minus 70 millivolts. This one is called the resting potential of the neuron. However, it is rarely that the neurons are in the resting state. They are generally busy because there is so much of information that the brain continuously receives from outside from the environment. Now, for this basically how the brain really starts processing or starts taking in this information and relaying it to the other areas of the brain is done by the neurons. So, messages keep on arriving from other neurons that actually influence the behavior of the neuron in question. So, the behavior could be like this resting potential could get higher up or it could get lowered down. Now, if the electrical charge of this neuron in question, let us say, rises to about minus 50 millivolts, the neuron will reach something called its threshold. A threshold is basically the trigger point of the neuron for firing. Once the neuron reaches its threshold, it also generates a signal from itself, which is called the nerve impulse or the action potential. Once the threshold is reached, the neuron actually fires this action potential, which actually sweeps down from the cell body towards the axons and towards the terminal buttons at around speeds of around up to 200 miles per hour. Now, let us try and understand what is happening during an action potential, how this signal is generated actually. The axon membrane basically is pierced by tiny tunnels or holes which are called ion channels. These channels act like gates which opens to allow the sodium ions to rush inside or into the axon. These channels open first near the soma and then throughout the length of the axon, and the action potential zips along. So, this happens in the soma, or which is the cell body, and then it starts opening consecutively along the length of the neuron, which is towards the axon, and this is how basically this action potential is zipping along. Each action potential is an all or a nothing event. So, a nerve impulse is first triggered near the soma, that is a cell body, and then a wave of activity travels down the length of the axon, as I already said. This is the diagram of how an action potential might be generated in a neuron. You can see that there is this gap between the terminal button of one neuron and the dendrites of the other neurons. When the action potential is fired, there is this exchange of neurotransmitters also between these two sets of neurons, which we will elaborate in just a while. Now, after each nerve impulse, the cell briefly dips below its resting level and then becomes less willing or less ready to fire. This negative after potential occurs basically because potassium ions have flowed out of the neuron while the membrane gates are open. So, this period basically is called the refractory period, when the neuron is not ready to fire. An interesting phenomena during or about the communication between neurons is the phenomena of saltatory conduction. Now, saltatory conduction basically has to do with the myelin sheath. If you remember the figure of the neuron that I just showed you, you can see that there is this covering over the fiber which is the axon, and this covering is basically a layer of a fatty substance which is called myelin sheath. Now, basically this covers some of the axon and it has some gaps in it. This basically ensures that the action potential travels rather quickly throughout the length of this axon. Now, instead of passing down this entire length of the axon, the action potential basically jumps from gaps to gap. There is this gap between the myelin sheath is actually throughout the axon. So, if you see here, you can see that the myelin sheath is actually covering this entire length of the axon fiber, but there are certain gaps. These gaps are basically called the nodes of Ranvier. Now, so basically instead of passing down through the entire length of the axon, the action potential actually jumps from gaps and gaps to gaps. So, for example, there will be channels opening, there will be channels opening at one gap, and then not throughout the length of the myelin sheath, but then they will again open up in the other gap. This is how you can say that the action potential is jumping from one gap to the other gap throughout the length of the axon. When an action potential finally reaches the tip of the axon terminals, neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic gap, which we just saw. These neurotransmitters basically are the chemicals that alter the activity in neurons. Neurotransmitters basically travel across the synaptic space between the terminal buttons of one neuron and the dendrites of another neuron, where they bind to these receptive sites at the dendrites of the neighboring neuron. Different terminals release different kinds of neurotransmitters, and different dendrites are particularly sensitive to different kinds of neurotransmitters. The dendrites will admit only the neurotransmitters if they are the right shape to fit in the receptor sites on the receiving neuron. The mechanism basically resembles like that of a lock and key. So, during the communication happening between these two neurons, when the action potential is fired, particular neurotransmitters are released, but only those neurotransmitters will be received by the neighboring neuron, for which there is an exact match between the kind of the neurotransmitter released and the kind of the receiver or receptor sites that are existing on the neighboring neuron. This is pretty much how a lock and key really function. Here you can see again the same diagram, wherein you can see that the neurotransmitters have been released from the terminal buttons of one of the neuron, and there are these receptor sites in the neighboring neuron which is receiving these neurotransmitters. Now, when these neurotransmitters basically are accepted by the receptor sites on the receiving neurons, their effects might be either excitatory or inhibitory. Now, what does excitatory or inhibitory mean? If the neuron is able to accept more than one neurotransmitter, then it will be influenced by excitatory or inhibitory process of each kind. Now, again coming back to what does excitatory or inhibitory mean. Excitatory action basically means that it will excite the neighboring neuron to fire an action potential. Inhibitory interaction means that the received neuron, the received neurotransmitter will inhibit the neuron which has received it to stop, it will inhibit it from firing an action potential. So, these are the two kinds of relationships that are possible. When the neuron basically receives more than one kind of neurotransmitter, it basically functions on the summation of the number of excitatory or inhibitory influences. Let us discuss a few neurotransmitters and how they actually affect human behavior. So, one of the very common neurotransmitters you will hear about is dopamine. Dopamine basically is involved in movement, motivation and emotion. So, dopamine, when dopamine is released, it basically produces feelings of pleasure and it is also involved in learning. Just as a side note, dopamine basically is linked to schizophrenic patients, basically wherein people experience increases in the level of dopamine release. Also, Parkinson's disease is linked to the reductions in the levels of dopamine, which kind of leads on to problems in particular kinds of movements. Another example could be acetylcholine. Acetylcholine basically is a common neurotransmitter used in the spinal cord and motor neurons to stimulate muscle contractions. It is also used in the brain to regulate memory, sleeping and dreaming. Now, Alzheimer's disease is linked to the undersupply of acetylcholine. Also, nicotine is basically supposed to be an agonist which acts that acts like acetylcholine. So, basically agonist is something that can replace a neurotransmitter in the kind of function. Endorphins are another class of neurotransmitters which are released in response to behaviors such as vigorous exercise, orgasm and eating spicy foods. Now, endorphins basically are natural pain relievers. They are related to the compounds found in drugs such as opium, morphine, heroin, etc. The release of endorphins basically creates a kind of a high in the runner or some say for example that people experience sometimes after heavy exercise. Now, this was about how the communication happens between neurons. Let us now move towards how the brain is structurally organized. Now, if you look at the brain, there are a variety of ways in which you can imagine that the brain could be organized. One of the first ways could be based on the location of the brain. Now, if you actually look at the brain, it could be very simply that there could be a brain, there could be one part of the brain basically which includes all the structures in the posterior part, which is your hindbrain. There could be something in the middle, which is your midbrain, and there could be something in the front, which is your forebrain. So, hindbrain basically includes all the structures which are located in the posterior part of the brain. The midbrain basically includes all the structure that is located in the middle part of the brain, and the forebrain is basically all the structures that are considered in the front part or the front of the brain. Now, another way of imagining the organization of the brain could be based on function. So, the central core or the brain stem could be which regulates our most primitive behaviors such as coughing, sneezing and other primitive behaviors which are under voluntary control such as vomiting, sleeping, eating, drinking, etc. This basically includes all the structures in the hindbrain and the midbrain and the true structures in the forebrain, which are the hypothalamus and the thalamus. Another structure important on the basis of function is the limbic system. The limbic system basically includes is a system of structures of the brain which basically have to do with controlling our emotions. Another important part of on the basis of function is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is basically the part which regulates our higher intellectual processes. Here you can see that there is the midbrain is located in the middle of the brain, the forebrain is structures in the anterior or the front part of the brain, and the hindbrain is structures that are at the back side of the brain. You can see the structures which are part of these three components. So, medulla, the medulla, pons, reticular formation and the cerebellum form part of what is called the hindbrain. the superior and inferior colliculus and substantia nigra form part of what is called the midbrain, and thalamus, hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and the limbic system and the cerebrum basically form part of what is called your forebrain. Here you can see all of these parts in this particular figure. You can see that there is a thalamus, hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland in the middle. You can see what the midbrain is. You can also see the cerebrum, you can see the cerebellum, and you can see medulla and reticular formation. Now, let us talk in a bit more detail about these parts of the brain. The hindbrain basically sits on the top of the spinal cord, and it is the crucial for most basic life functions. It has these parts, the medulla, which is the first slight enlargement of the spinal cord as it is just entering the skull, and it is a narrow structure that basically controls breathing and some reflexes that help in maintaining upright posture. The pons are above the medulla, and they are important for the control of things like attentiveness as well as the timing of sleep. Now, at this point, the major nerve tracts coming up from the spinal cord cross over so that the right side of the brain is connected to the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain is connected to the right side of the body. Here you can see the pons and the medulla. Talking about reticular formation, the reticular formation basically is a network of neural circuits that extends from the lower brain stem right up to the thalamus in the forebrain and transversing some of the other central core structures. This network of neurons basically acts to control arousal. The reticular formation also plays a role in our ability to focus the attention on particular kinds of stimuli. All of the sense receptors have nerve fibers that feed into the reticular system, which appears to act as a filter. The reticular formation also allows some sensory messages to pass through the cerebral cortex while blocking some others. Here you can see that the reticular formations can be seen. Now, cerebellum. Cerebellum basically is attached to the rear of the brain stem, which is slightly above the medulla and is basically a convoluted structure. It is primarily concerned with the coordination of movement. Specific movements may be initiated at higher levels, but the coordination of these movements basically depends on this structure called the cerebellum. Damage to cerebellum sometimes results in jerky, uncoordinated movements. Movements resemble the point when, say, for example, somebody is drunk and cannot stand properly, and those kind of things. You can see that the cerebellum is right at the back of the brain. The cerebellum is also important for learning new motor responses. Every time you are actually planning to learn a new motor skill, say for example cycling, swimming, particular kinds of physical sports, the cerebellum is an important area which helps you learn those motor skills. There are direct neural connections between the cerebellum and the frontal parts of the brain, which also helps to basically helps your ability of in learning languages, ability of planning and reasoning future events. The cerebellum also has been found to play a role in the control and coordination of higher mental processes like thinking, imagining, those kind of things. Coming to the midbrain. The midbrain is a relatively small area in the humans, and it is found just above the pons and it is surrounded by the forebrain. There are these parts, the superior and inferior colliculi, the basically two small structures which are important for relaying of sensory information to the brain and for movement control. So, these are the areas which are basically receiving all the information from the spinal cords onwards, and then they relay it to the other parts of the brain to get processed further. Another part which forms a part of the midbrain is the substantia nigra. The substantia nigra is basically just located above the midbrain and is a crucial part of the dopamine containing pathway, also known as the reward pathway. So, this is the pathway which makes people feel good. If you remember on the earlier slides, I talked about dopamine as being the pleasure system or the pleasure neurotransmitter. This structure basically deteriorates in people having Parkinson's disease. Here you can see the thalamus. Coming to the forebrain. In humans, the forebrain is basically a relatively large, and it covers the midbrain and parts of the hindbrain. A large part of it, basically the cerebrum, is also called the cerebral cortex, basically a word borrowed from the Latin word for bark. The other structures of the forebrain, which is the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the areas comprising the limbic system, they are just found beneath the cerebrum and are referred to as subcortical structures. Thalamus basically is just located above the midbrain inside of the cerebral hemispheres, and basically these are two egg shaped groups of nerve cells. Okay. The thalami basically act as sensory relay stations which are directing incoming information from the sense receptors, the five senses, vision, hearing, taste, touch, etc., and they direct these to the cerebrum where these are processed. The hypothalamus basically is a much smaller structure, is located just below the thalamus. It is one of the structures which is, it is actually one of the main structures involved in regulating eating, drinking, sleeping and sexual behavior. The hypothalamus is also involved in maintaining something called the homeostasis, which is basically how which is basically a system that controls the autonomic nervous system. Homeostasis basically is a term that refers to the level of functioning that is characteristic of a healthy or normal individual. If say for example, there is elevated blood pressure or the body has less of nutrition, these kind of things disturb the homeostasis, and the hypothalamus basically directs the brain to take steps to restore this balance or restore the homeostasis. You can see that the hypothalamus and the thalamus in this figure. Now, say for example, when an organism is under stress, this homeostasis is disturbed and then the processes are set in motion to correct this lack of equilibrium. Say for example, if you are too warm in the summer season, or say for example, if you are too cold, steps will be taken to actually restore the balance. Say for example, if you are too warm, the body starts sweating so that the temperature of the body comes down. Or say for example, if you are too cold, the body starts shivering, some kind of a movement is created that also generates heat and keeps the body from getting too cold. Both these processes basically are intentioned to restore the normal temperature and are controlled by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus also plays an important role in the sensation of emotions and in our response in stress situations. Now, a mild, why do I say this? That a mild electrical stimulation of certain areas in the hypothalamus has been found to produce feelings of pleasure. Stimulus of certain adjacent regions in the hypothalamus has also been found to be linked to producing unpleasant emotions. So, this is one of the ways evidences which would actually tell you that okay, the hypothalamus is actually involved in these sensing of emotions. Pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is part of the limbic system. It is also the most important part of the glands called the endocrine system. The hypothalamus basically controls the endocrine system and thus it also controls the production of various kinds of hormones. Coming to the limbic system. The limbic system basically is the area around the central core of the brain and these are very closely interconnected with the hypothalamus. Okay, these are a set of structures that impose additional control over some of the instinctive behaviors regulated by the central core. The hippocampus, which is basically a part of the limbic system that plays a special role in memory. The amygdala is an almond shaped structure deep within the brain. It is very critical in experiencing emotions such as fear. Humans with damage to the amygdala are unable to recognize facial expressions of fear and also they have this inability to learn new fear responses. Here you can see the amygdala. Now, to sum up today's lecture, we talked about the basic neural organization of the brain that governs human behavior. We also talked about the structure and the functions of the neurons, and finally we talked about the organizational principles of the brain. In the next class, we will talk about the cerebral cortex. Thank you.